быть. И хорошее произведение искусства, например, они как, да, понимает он тебя, да. Да вот именно так, сказка такая. Вперед, назад. А вот себе уже. Ну, наверное, нет, ладно. Ну, народ тогда, да. 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 Не знаю. Наверное, нет. Да. Да. Тепле, тепле. Да, понимаю, да, да. Новые условия бытия, да, новые условия. Да, да. Ну, есть он самый, да. Шок себе. Да. Понимаю, да. Он себя ведет. Ладно уж, давай надо. Ну тут, так, ну да, типа того, надо нет. Что еще? Что видишь?
Только в движении понимаешь, что главное – это не цель, а вдохновение, которое находишь на пути к ней. Оно укажет, куда двигаться дальше, чтобы ты смог создать что-то новое и вдохновить остальных.
Сколько шагов вам осталось до цели?
Не меньше 1000.
Похвально. А чтобы заработать 1000 рублей, нужно всего 2 шага. Оформляйте бесплатную мультикарту ВТБ Виза и совершайте первую покупку. Получите 1000 рублей на счет. ВТБ, все получится.
This video has been sponsored by ExpressVPN. About 2 years ago, I think I was doing research for my ferrofluid project, and I ended up watching a short video about superconductors. I don't remember exactly what video it was, or where I even saw it, but I do clearly remember that it kind of blew my mind. They showed that if a magnet is dropped on top of a superconductor, it just floats there like some anti-gravity magic. At first, I thought that it was just carefully balancing there or something, but it could be easily pushed around to different positions. On top of this, what was even cooler in my opinion was that when it was gently nudged, it was able to just freely spin around. After seeing this, I immediately went to Google to see how hard it was to make a superconductor myself. Based on what I saw, it seemed like it was possible, but it also seemed like it was really complicated. So I kind of procrastinated for the next year and a half until this past January, when I decided to finally commit myself to it. When I looked into it a bit more, I found that superconductors can technically be made from a lot of different materials. However, for most of them to work, they need to be cool to ridiculously low temperatures. For example, just mercury can apparently be a superconductor, but only when it's lower than negative 269 C, which for me is just impossible. The superconductor that I saw in that video, though, was called a YBCO superconductor, and it didn't have to be nearly that cold. It only had to be lower than negative 181 C, which I could easily do by just soaking it in liquid nitrogen. I did a bit more research, and I found that there were other ones that also worked with liquid nitrogen. However, I couldn't find much info on how to make them, and from what I did find, they all seemed to be a bit more difficult. So, YBCO really seemed like it was the best option. Okay, so I committed to making YBCO, and now I had to put together some sort of procedure. Like before, I reached out to Google for help, and the first result that I got was probably the best one. It was a video by Ben over on the channel Applied Science, and he was able to make a working superconductor. He covered almost all the essential info about the process, and it was extremely helpful. The only thing that I wanted to change was the final shape of the YBCO. Ben had just used a crucible as a mold, so it wasn't exactly the most beautiful looking thing, but I wanted mine to be some nice and pretty pellets just like I had seen in that video. In the description, he also gave a link to the full-length procedure that I assume he followed. It was probably the most detailed procedure on the internet, and it made everything seem relatively straightforward. So, I decided to do exactly what they did, except on a larger scale. However, when I actually sat down and started doing some calculations, I realized that none of their numbers made any sense. YBCO is called YBCO because it's a combination of yttrium, barium, copper, and oxygen. However, it's also sometimes called yttrium 123 because of the ratio between the components. There's always 1 yttrium, 2 bariums, and 3 coppers. In this case though, they don't seem to be using this 1-2-3 ratio, even though they say that they are. On top of this, they did a whole bunch of seemingly pointless calculations, and they also used a number that was blatantly just wrong. This isn't to blast them or anything though, because calculation errors happen all the time, but it meant that I couldn't rely on what I had here. It was very possible that the rest of the info was still good, and it probably was, but after seeing this, I really just didn't trust it. So, I scoured the internet for a new procedure, and a few days later, I was thankfully able to find this one. It wasn't nearly as detailed, and it didn't have any photos, but it actually gave numbers that were accurate. Now, before I could actually get started, I had to buy a bunch of chemicals. The first 2 were yttrium oxide and copper nitrate, and I was able to find both of them on eBay. I also needed barium nitrate, but I wasn't able to find it anywhere online. So, I unfortunately ended up just overpaying for it and ordering it from a chemical company. The last thing that I needed was citric acid, which is commonly used in food, so it was really easy to find, and I got 2 pounds of it from Amazon. At this point, I had all the ingredients that I needed, but I started to worry about the purity of the eBay chemicals. The copper nitrate was all nice crystals and it looked okay, but I really wasn't sure about the yttrium oxide. The eBay listing said that it was over 99% pure, however you can never really trust those claims. So unfortunately, I was going to have to purify it, and the best way that I found was to convert it to yttrium nitrate. To do this, I added 200 mils of water, along with about 100 mils of concentrated nitric acid. I let it stir for a couple minutes, and then I started adding some of the yttrium oxide. The amount that I added here was kind of random, but when I eventually felt that it was enough, I turned on the hot plate. Right now, nothing was really happening, but when it got hot enough, the yttrium oxide suddenly started reacting with the nitric acid. This quickly turned it all into yttrium nitrate, which unlike the oxide, was soluble in water. This caused the solution to slowly clear up, and after this, I just kept adding the oxide whenever it looked like it was fading. It eventually got to a point where it stopped clearing up, and this meant that all the nitric acid was gone. I then added a bit more nitric acid, just enough to destroy the extra oxide. This caused it to clear up again, but it was still a bit cloudy, and there was a whole bunch of solid junk that was floating around. I had no idea what this was, and it was all just some sort of impurity. So, it was apparently a good thing that I decided to clean it up. To get rid of it, I filtered it all through some cotton and sea light, and this left me with a nice and clear solution. I then put it all back on the hot plate, and I got rid of most of the water. I honestly didn't know exactly how much I had to get rid of, and I just went until it was roughly half the volume that I started with.
Детям нужно, очень много для счастья. Гоночные аттракционы, изысканные деликатесы, удивительные открытия. И я могу, чтобы детского счастья стало еще больше, воспользуйтесь выплатами при рождении ребенка в рамках национального проекта «Демография».
Киндер представляет. Сканируйте QR-код на упаковке Киндер-шоколад, и вас ждет увлекательная игра про животных. Подробности на kinder.com.
After that, I took out the stir bar, and I waited for it to cool to room temperature. it sit like this for a few hours, but nothing really happened. So I started poking at it a bit to force the yttrium nitrate to crystallize. I wasn't sure if this was going to work, but it did, and there were a bunch of small crystals that formed around the stir rod. I then gently stirred the whole thing, and I let it sit overnight. The next day, there was a whole bunch of yttrium nitrate at the bottom, and I broke it into smaller pieces. To separate it, I poured it all into a vacuum filter, and I was eventually left with some clean and fluffy crystals. It was all still covered in water though, and to fully dry it up, I put it all into a vacuum chamber that had some drying agent at the bottom. I pulled a full vacuum on it, and then I took it out a few days later. What I had now was some dry and crunchy yttrium nitrate. This of course wasn't the oxide that I had started with, and if I specifically needed it to be the oxide, part of the purification process would have been converting it back. But conveniently, turning the oxide into the nitrate is actually the first step in a lot of YBCO procedures, including the one that I was following. So, this whole purification was kind of just a slightly more complicated first step. At this point,
Мне нравится. Ну, это есть он там. Да, когда он это делает. Серьезно, что ли? Здесь кликер? This is on zone. This is on. Тоже так. Елитарно. Елитарно. Да, вот это и есть оно, отличку, да, да, понимаю, звено культуры, да, понимаю. Света, да, но он тебе так говорит. Да, верно, ну ладно. Ну, наоборот, интересно мне это, да, ты знаешь, да, да. Своим неплохим назвал, да, понимаешь. Вот это и есть он самый, да. Да, вот это и был он самый, да. Вот это, да, вот это и был он, да, да, да. Да, вот это, да. Ну как хочешь, да. Да. Да, я сам. Да, вот это. Да, понимаете. Да, Киселева. Ну тут вот интересно.